Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another exciting chapter of the Book of Enoch. And tonight we're going to be talking about the birth of Noah, which is this kind of a little vignette that's tacked on to the end of the epistle. It kind of, in the framework of Enoch, it's a continuation of Enoch kind of talking to Methuselah, right? And so let's look at it. And it has a lot of parallels with a part of the Genesis Apocryphon. So first, we're going to start with the Book of Enoch, and then we're going to go to the Genesis Apocryphon. When we go to the Genesis Apocryphon, I will explain about that book. Okay, so let's take a look. Sharing my screen. So here we have in front of us, again, the translation that we've been using, Nicholsburg's translation, the birth of Noah. And again, it doesn't have a separate title in the text. It just kind of continues on. If we go back, right, with the epistle, so it's Enoch speaking to Methuselah, to Methuselah. So it continues on and says, after time, I took a wife for Methuselah, my son, and she bore a son and called his name Lamech. Righteousness was brought low until that day. And when Lamech had come of age, he took for himself a wife, and she conceived from him and bore a child. And when the child was born, his body was, this is Noah, his body was whiter than snow and redder than a rose. His hair was all white and like white wool and curly. Glorious was his face. When he opened his eyes, the house shone like the sun. And he stood up from the hands of the midwife, and he opened his mouth and praised the Lord of eternity. Now, just a second, because I want to just clarify, because this comes up a lot when we talk about Lamech, and people automatically think of the famous Lamech. So let me move come here. This is the genealogy we're talking about here. Okay. Yared has Chanoch, Enoch. Yared dies. Yared is because of Yared's name, which means to descend, right? There's a connection that's made in Enoch and other literature between Yared and the descent of the angels in his time. That it is in his time that the angels descend to mate with human women, right? So, but there's Yared. Then afterwards he has Chanoch, Enoch. Enoch has Methuselah. And after Methuselah, he walks with God for 300 years. In other words, he's up there in heaven, okay? And he manages to have sons and daughters. He dies at 360. He doesn't really die at 365 because God takes him. We don't know what the story is exactly. And then when Methuselah has lived 187 years, he has Lamech. This Lamech is different. Well, we're in Genesis 5. We're in Breshit Hey. This is a different Lamech from the one that we're used to from the previous chapter. Now, genealogies in Breshit, in Genesis, are doubled a lot. You have the same names coming up. So in the earlier chapter, you have Cain. Cain has someone named Chanoch, Enoch. Enoch, okay, has Irad. Irad has Mehuyael. Mehuyael has Metushael. Right? It sounds a lot like Methuselah, right? And Metushael has Lamech. This is a genealogy from Cain. These are the guys who found cities, right? Why? Because Cain doesn't get to work the land anymore. He is expelled from the land. And so naturally, he's going to have cities, right? And so you have cities, they create culture, they create all sorts of things. Lamech is the guy who takes two wives and then talks about the famous poem, O wives of Lamech, give ear to my speech. I have slain a person for wounding me and a lad for bruising me. Ish halagti lepitzi v'yeled lechoburati ki shevatayim yukam Cain v'Lamech shivim b'shivah. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. Right? We don't know. It's hard to quite like that. It would require a whole kind of little mini lecture to go into what exactly is meant here, but what is clear is that there's violence. Lamech is a person of violence, right? Vengeance and violence, all right? As is appropriate from the line of Cain of Cain. Okay. However, when we're reading here in chapter 5, we have a lot of the same names coming up, but it's a different line. That line, let's go back to see, let's go back here. That line comes from Enosh. Enosh is the third, Enosh comes from Shet, rather. And Shet is the third child, right? Shet comes after the whole story with Cain and Abel, with Cain and Hevel. And from Shet is the line that ends in Noah. And that's important for anyone who cares about, wait, are we descended from this horrible sinner Cain? And the answer is no. We come from Noah, and Noah comes from Shet, who's born after this whole thing. Okay, so we move on. And so this is the line we're talking about. And I'm mentioning it because as soon as you hear Lamech, everyone thinks of the vengeful Lamech. That's not the Lamech we're talking about here. Now, obviously, biblical critics are going to say, oh, it's the same genealogy, it's in 2 copies, But let's face it, if for a Second Temple reader, that's absolutely not true. You're talking about 2 different genealogies. You're talking about one coming and in fact in the Jewish tradition, right? You're talking about one genealogy coming from Cain, another genealogy coming from Seth, from Shet, and never the two shall meet. They just happen to have a lot of the same names. Okay, so here we have Hanoch, his son Metushelach, and Metushelach has Lamech, and Lamech has Noah. Okay, as he gets a son, Vayikrat Shmo Noach Lemor, Zei Nachamenu Mima'asenu Umetzvon Yadenu Min Hadama Asher Erera Adonai, and he named him Noach, saying, "This one will provide us relief from our work and from the toil of our hands, out of the very from the earth that God cursed." Right, God cursed it, and this seems to it's not clear. Is that the curse? It sounds like it's the curse from Adam, because that is part of Adam's curse when Adam sins, is that the earth isn't just going to easily bear grain. You're going to have to work hard, right? And history goes on, and Noach has his sons, and then we come to the flood. All right, so let's go back now to our text. Okay, so Noach is born, and immediately he's different. And this explains a little bit of why did Lamech think, when he named Noach, saying, this one is going to kind of break the curse. Why would he say that? And the answer is, this child was special from the beginning. This is also going to link us to the sin of the watchers, right? Which is very important in the way Second Temple readers are reading the biblical story or listening to the biblical story, depending on how they're consuming it. Right. And when the child was born, his body was whiter than snow. When he opened his eyes, the house shone like sun. And he stood up from the hands of the midwife, and he opened his mouth and praised the Lord of return. Look, he can talk from day one. He comes out of the womb and he is praying. This is a special kid. The problem is that everyone's just gone through a generation in this story, in this narrative. Everyone's just gone through a generation where what happened? Where angels came down and mated with human women. Angels come down, mating with human women. Lamech's wife is pregnant. She has a baby, and this baby comes out shining and praying. And he's like, oh, what's going on here? Right? He's like, I can add 1 and 1 and get 2, right? So what's the story? And Lamech was afraid of him, and he fled and came to Methuselah, Metushelach, his father. And he said to him, a strange child has been born to me. He is not like human beings, but like the sons of the angels of heaven. His form is strange, not like us. His eyes are like the rays of the sun, and glorious is his face. I think that he is not from me, but from the angels, and I fear him, lest something happen in his days on the earth. In other words, I'm worried that this kid's not my kid. This kid is a kid from one of these angels that came down and mated with human women. And not only that, the fact that I had this kid, that means bad things are going to happen during his lifetime. I beg you, Father, and beseech you, go to Enoch, our father. Now, he's talking to Metushelach. Metushelach's father is Enoch, is Hanoch. And he says, go to him and learn the truth from him, for his dwelling is with the angels. If you remember, in the biblical narrative, as soon as he has Metushelach, he's off with the angels. He's off with God or with the angels. He's up in heaven. So he can find out. He can find out where this kid comes from. When Metushelach heard the words of his son, He came to me at the ends of the earth where he heard I was then. Methuselah is somehow able to reach Enoch in heaven. And he said to me, my father, hear my voice and come to me. And I heard his voice and came to him and said, look, here I am, child. Why have you come to me, child? He answered and said, because of great distress I have come to you. Because of a terrible vision I've approached here, father. And now, my father, hear me, for a child has been born to Lamech, my son, and his form and appearance are not like the form of human beings. And his color is whiter than snow and redder than a rose. The hair of his head is whiter than white wool. His eyes are like the rays of the sun. And he opened his eyes and made the whole house bright. And he stood up from the hands of the midwife, and he opened his mouth and praised the Lord of eternity. And Lamech, my son, was afraid, and he fled to me. He does not believe that the child is his son, but that he is from the angels of heaven. And look, I have come to you because from the angels you have the exact facts and the truth. Then I, Enoch, answered and said, the Lord will renew his commandment upon the earth, just as, child, I have seen and told you. And now this is putting it in the context of the epistle and the apocalypse of weeks. Okay, he's saying, look, this is actually a sign that God's going to renew his commandment on earth. Okay, that in the generation of Yared, my father, they transgressed the word of the Lord, the covenant of heaven. And this is kind of this is you can see here. There's it's trying to fix it. So either there was a double reading here that derives from alternative translations of the Aramaic, or a verb has dropped from the text. Okay, but it's been so it's they transgressed the word of the Lord / the covenant of heaven. So it's not clear what's going on here, but it's the meaning is clear. And look, they went on sinning and transgressing the custom. Those are the angels in the generation, remember, of Yared, whose name means descend. And so it's connected, it's in his generation, the angels came down. With women, they were mingling. With them, they were sinning. They married some of them, and they went on begetting children, not like spirits, but of flesh. This is the sin of the angels, that they did not keep to what they should have been doing as spirits, but decided to do what flesh does. And there will be great wrath upon the earth and a flood, and there will be great destruction for a year. So he's prophesying the flood. He's like, you had a child. This is what's going to happen. There's going to be a flood to wipe the earth clean of the sin that the angels did. And this child that was born to you will be left on the earth, and his 3 children will be saved with him when all people on the earth die. And he will cleanse the earth from the corruption that is on it. And now tell Lamech, he is your child in truth, and this child will be righteous and blameless. And Noah call his name, for he will be your remnant from whom you will find rest. And that's why we call him, why will you understand you'll find rest from him? Because I'm giving you this whole prophecy. There's going to be a flood, and he's going to be the one to restore humankind. He and his sons will be saved from the corruption of the earth, from all sins and from all iniquities that are consummated on the earth in his days. Right? And then goes on, and after this, there will be stronger iniquity than that which was formerly consummated on the earth. Now, for I know the mysteries of the Lord, that the holy ones have revealed and shown to me, that I have read in the tablets of heaven. If you remember in the epistle, there's this idea, everything's been written already in the tablets of heaven. And I've seen written in them that generation upon generation will do evil in this way. Evil will be until there arise generations of righteousness, and evil and wickedness will end. Now it's talking about the final end time, the final apocalyptic end time, and evil and wickedness will end, and violence will cease from the earth, and good things will come upon the earth to them. Now go, child, and tell Lamech, your son, that this child that has been born is his child, truly and without deception. In other words, your child is not the angel's child. On the contrary, your child is going to allow humans to survive when the earth is cleansed from the angel's sin. When Methuselah heard the words of Enoch, his father, for Enoch revealed them to him secretly, Methuselah returned and revealed everything to Lamech, and his name was called Noah, he who gladdens the earth from destruction. Okay. And then there's a final chapter, but let's continue with Noah here. So I'm going to go back a little bit. That was pretty short, right? But what we all noticed, I'm sure, is this description of the birth of Noah, that he glows. When he opened his eyes, the house shone like the sun, right? And his eyes are like the rays of the sun, and glorious is his face. Okay, now I'm sure that you all immediately thought of who glows on birth, right? Moses in the midrash, or rather in the Gemara, he glows on birth, and he also in the actual biblical narrative, his face shines, right? His face glows as an adult. So let's take a look at that for just a moment. for maybe more than a moment. So here in Shmot and Exodus, Lamed Daled Chaf Tet 34:29, Vayihi bered Moshe mehar Sinai u'shnei luchot ha'edut bayad Moshe b'rito min hahar u'Moshe lo yada ki karan or panav b'dabro ito. So Moshe came down from Mount Sinai, and as Moshe came down from the mountain bearing the 2 tablets, right? Moshe was not aware that the skin of his face was glowing. There were rays of light coming from his face since he had spoken with him, is literally, and this is translating with God, right? And in fact, everyone sees that his face glows and they are afraid of him, and he ends up having to wear a mask, right? So Moshe glows as an adult because he has essentially, in a way at least, met God, right? And so now he glows. He's not quite, he has something special about him. Now, but Noach, of course, is born glowing as a baby. And those of us who are familiar with the story of Moshe are used to this. And let's turn to the Talmud in Sota Yud Bet Aleph. That's Sota 12a, right? Yud Bet Amud Aleph. We have this explanation in the verse when Moshe is born and he is being hidden. It says that he was born and his mother sees that he is good. Kitovu. What does that mean, that he is good? Okay, so here in this Braita, in this kind of external Mishnaic or Tanaitic, we say external Tanaitic passage being brought in the Talmud, it says Vatero Toki Tofu. Tanya Rabbi Meir Omer Tov Shmo. What does it mean that Tov was his name? Rabbi Yehuda Omer Rabbi Yehuda says Tovia Shmo. His name is Tovia. A little strange. Rabbi Nechemia Omer Hagun L'Neviut. Rabbi Nechemia says she saw that he was ready for prophecy, that he's someone who will be able to prophesy. Others say Nolad Shehu Mahu, born circumcised. In other words, he was born perfect, right? He was born circumcised. You could see it. This makes a little bit more sense. Like, what would she be able to see on a baby that would make it special? She saw that it was circumcised. The Chachamim Omrim, the sages say, B'sha'ah shenolad Moshe nitmaleh habayit kulo or. When Moshe was born, the whole house filled with light. Tivhacha batero to kitofu uchtivhatam bayar Elohim et or kitov. And they bring a verse to prove it. It says that she saw him, that he's good, and it's written when God creates light, he saw the light that it was good. So that's the proof text. Shana Strauss-Schick, a scholar and a friend, has written about this, and she argues that this part of the Braita is actually a later Babylonian edition. She brings a lot of proofs. If you want to see her article, it is actually available online in thegemara.com. And she brings several reasons to say that this passage and the sages say that this is a Babylonian edition. It shows up later in the Gemara in the words of an Amora, in other words, and it does not show up in midrash from the land of Israel. So this seems to be very possibly a Babylonian edition. And she argues that there's a possible parallel here with stories that were told about Zoroaster. That Zoroaster, when he was born, light shone from his house. When he was born, his village filled with light. And that these were stories about Zoroaster that here are being applied to Moshe. Now, what's interesting here, and we're going to see this in the Genesis Apocryphon as well, is that we're seeing a similar story being told about Noah within a savior story, within a story of Noah as savior. Is this an argument against Zoroastrian influence? Not quite. It does say that this tradition of glowing at birth being an indicator that you are a savior of the people, right? It does seem to show that it could be a very early tradition. Does it mean that there wasn't any Persian influence? No, it does not, because this is the Second Temple period, after Jews have in fact lived gone through the Persian period and had been in close contact with Persian ideas and thoughts. And especially one of the things that, and I do think that it's important to note, one of the things that easily passes through is ways you tell a story. In other words, you might not share a lot theologically with Zoroastrian priests, but if people are telling certain stories and there are certain tropes, we wouldn't be surprised to find that these tropes are being used, are passing through folklore, right? So it wouldn't be that strange for when you're describing the Savior saying, and the house filled with light at his birth, as indicating that he will be a Savior. So it could be, the question is, of course, when does this happen? Is this an early thing, or does it happen on two separate occasions? I mean, you could also say, well, this is a Jewish tradition, right? But if you're saying that there's Persian influence involved, you could say, is it happening in the Second Temple period and then again in the Sasanian period? Is there some kind of through line that we're missing? It's an interesting thing to think about. We will see it also in the Genesis Apocryphon as we look at it. I'm going to make a pause because I see that, yes, so I see that Susan noted that it reminds that it's reminiscent of the midrash about Moshe. Absolutely. Yes, so it's as I expected, this is automatically kind of brings to our mind the stories about Moshe. Now, Noah as Savior, it's actually very interesting that there was apparently quite a tradition in the Second Temple period of Noah as kind of almost this messianic figure. And when we look at the Book of Watchers more in depth, when we look at the Watchers story, we'll see that in the Book of Enoch, the period after the flood is initially portrayed as a period without sin, then all of a sudden sin has been vanquished, as if we're talking about the Messianic age. There is this kind of idea of Noah as a much more important figure than he becomes later on, right? So he seems to be this kind of savior figure in several works. And there's more written about him than we would expect. Let's put it that way. So let's take a look. After we've looked at the Noah story in the Book of Enoch, let's see the parallels that we can find in the Genesis Apocryphon. I'm going to share my screen and then I'm going to say a little bit about the book. Okay, so what you see on your screen here on the right is a piece of the Genesis Apocryphon in Aramaic. On the left, you see a translation of what we're going to be reading. It's column 2 of the Genesis Apocryphon. This translation is Michael Siegel and Matthew Morgenstern's translation from outside the Bible. That's what we're using. It's for those of you who want it in the as a handout, I can send it to you later. I sent you a handout with it, just much more simple translation. And a little bit about the Genesis Apocryphon. So the Genesis Apocryphon was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a classic example of something that's found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is nevertheless not sectarian. In other words, this is a text the Dead Sea sect copied, but they didn't compose it, right? They thought it was a good read. I mean, we have one copy. It was in Cave 1. It was found in Cave 1. So that indicates that it was in the scrolls that they were trying to keep for posterity, apparently. And it's dated to the 1st century BCE or earlier. 1st century BCE, that dating is both of the manuscript itself and of the Aramaic by Kutcher. Kutcher dates Aramaic to about 1st century BCE. However, that dating is a guess. It could be earlier than the 1st century BCE. It's very hard to know. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Can you explain, well, like, why is it important that it's in Cave 1? Like, what does it tell us? What does it mean that it's kept for the future?
I'll tell you. I did make a leap there. Okay, so my leap was, if we think about things like the community rule from Cave 1, texts of that nature, things that were, I don't think the Genesis Apocryphon, I do not believe, was wrapped and preserved the way some of the other scrolls were. But to me, the fact that it was found in that cave may indicate that it was specifically being saved, as opposed to if it's in Cave 4. And I actually do think and I have to look into this, my apologies, I don't remember offhand, if there are copies in K4, there may have been copies in K4. K4 is considered more of the working library. I mean, again, there's so many layers of suppositions when we're talking about the Qumran community, right? So if we're saying they lived at Qumran, right, then K4 was their library, right? Because it was right there. Many, many, many scrolls not being wrapped up and preserved, not being wrapped up and put into jars, just out. When they first found the scrolls in K4, they were so tattered and ragged and in fragments that the people who found them thought that the Romans had ripped them up in anger. And then they realized, no, these were simply scrolls that had been left and disintegrated like scrolls do, even in a dry climate like Qumran. These scrolls that were very well preserved were wrapped in oilcloth and put in jars, and they were meant to be preserved. Now, Genesis Apocryphon was not one of these, as far as I know, but the Genesis Apocryphon was not one of these. But still, the idea that it was found in Cave 1, to me, may indicate that they wanted to keep it for some reason, and they thought it was important. It's not necessarily, it could be that they just left it there, but and also if you ever look at, and again, it's different whether you think that they lived at Qumran or whether you don't accept the idea that they lived at Qumran. If you accept the idea that they lived at Qumran, Cave 1 is not really close. Cave 1 is kind of over the ridge, right? So it's not like, oh yeah, we're putting it there because we just want to grab some reading material. We're putting it there to keep it there. Whereas again, Cave 4 is right there, tons and tons of scrolls, and the sort of thing that, okay, we'll just grab it and read it. So Susan asked, would K4 be a Geniza? It's generally not considered to be a Geniza. It's generally considered to be where they kept the scrolls that they wanted to have access to all the time. And again, when we look at how they found scrolls in Cave 1 and some other caves where they were wrapped up and preserved, you can tell that they weren't meant to take it out again and read it. It was meant to be kept carefully in that cave, whereas Cave 4 it was just meant to be out. So I'm working on a bunch of assumptions there, right? Those are like, that's one of the working assumptions that we have, is that Cave 4 was more of a, was more accessible, and that's why it had so many scrolls in K4. And that's why, of course, they're fragmented, because they dissolve, they, disintegrated. Okay, so let's move on. So is Cave 1 thought to be something of a kasefet, of a safe? I think of it that way. I'm sure that there are many other opinions. I think in general, and not just Cave 1, because Cave 1 wasn't the only cave with scrolls preserved that way. I think certainly of the scrolls that were wrapped and put in jars, that was for safekeeping. That was clearly for safekeeping. And why they thought they needed it for safekeeping, was it an archive of sorts that they just wanted to just be sure that they had a copy, or were they expecting something to happen? That's a different question. So there are many theories about that. So let's continue on. We can always come back to it later.
Miriam?
Yes.
Speak it. What ended the Qumran community? Did they end when Masada ended, or did they end?
Probably it seems like the Romans ended it. It seems like the Romans ended Qumran. That's what it seems like. The Romans ended Qumran. The Romans conquered it and ended it. They made it into a fortress, became a Roman fortress, and that was that. Now, to the extent that you want to say that they are Essenes or may have been identified as Essenes, Josephus talks about how brave the Essenes were in the revolt, because they expected to get their souls back. In other words, they expected to be reborn, resurrected. The Qumran community does not talk a lot about resurrection. I won't say they don't talk at all about resurrection, but it's not a major part of what they talk about in terms of their belief system. But it seems pretty clear that what finished them were the Romans, right?
How long was it thought to have served as a Roman fortress?
I don't know. I have to look it up. I can grab my book now and see. But it became a Roman fortress. Yeah. And it was Hanan Eshel had I heard a whole talk from Hanan Eshel saying that you can see that it wasn't a typical Roman, in other words, that they took over the Qumran community, not that it was built as a fortress. Which was, again, there are many arguments about did the Qumran community live at Qumran, right? Did the sect, let's not call it, did the sect live at Qumran? Is the site actually connected to the sect, right? So Hanan Eshel was arguing constantly that yes, and that it doesn't look like anything else. It doesn't look like a regular agricultural settlement. It doesn't look like a regular fortress. It doesn't look like these other things that people were saying it was from an archaeological standpoint. I am not an archaeologist, so I have to rely on archaeologists with what they say. And as I've said numerous times, that as a text person, it doesn't matter as much. I mean, it does matter when you say, oh, I think K4 was the library, right? Then it does matter. But if you're a text person, you can get everything you're learning from the text. You're not really learning it from the site so much. Rather, people who are trying to figure out what's going on in the site try to learn from the text. So for archaeologists, it's very important to say, was this the Qumran, where the Qumran community lived or not? Whereas for text people, it's very nice to be able to point to it and say, look, this is where they are, and this is where they kept their books, and all. But it's not necessary in order to understand the texts.
But,
yes.
It would almost sound like how the books are left in cave 4, that they were taken by surprise somehow, that they didn't have time to do something to save the library.
Well, also, I would think that if you're fighting against the Romans, and also realize, and this is something that the more you read Second Temple literature, the more you see, everyone was just waiting for this. Everyone said there's going to be an end. There's going to be this apocalyptic, and then you have this fight with the Romans, and they're like, this is it. This is it. This is the battle that everyone's been waiting for, right? So did they, were they expecting to be defeated? I would imagine they weren't. That's my guess, right? My guess, they may not have been absolutely sure that they personally would live, but to say that that everyone would be defeated, I imagine they did not think that. I'll just remind you that under Bar Kokhba, people took their keys with them, right? They went into hiding with the keys to their houses. They locked up and they went into hiding in the caves because they were going to get back to their houses when this was over. So there wasn't, now we can look back and say, oh, well, of course they were going to lose. They absolutely did not think that. So it makes sense to have some, so again, things like Cave 1 and other, the scrolls that were very carefully preserved could have been preserved not because of the Romans. And again, and I have to look again and see what the dating is. I'm sure they've dated, when it was wrapped, but just because they want to make sure that this remains, that they have the important scrolls of the community are preserved. And again, the Genesis Apocryphon, I'm not saying it's necessarily an important scroll of the community. I'm just wondering, it doesn't mean something that it's in Cave 1. What was I going to say? Yeah. So, but the cave, but they're not going to pack up their entire library. That obviously is not going to, it's just not going to work, right? If they found remains, they think of 800 scrolls in Cave 4. So no one was packing up 800 scrolls when they're fighting off the Romans, right? So that's, that now again, when they say they found fragments of 800 scrolls, some of the fragments are this big. So were they really 800 scrolls or not? But that's something that has been said. So if you have that many scrolls, you're probably not gonna wrap it all up. You don't have time. It's not where your priorities are. So yeah.
Miriam, regarding the connection between the community and the scrolls, the people who live there. So there is quite a lot of evidence from what they found in Qumran that shows, doesn't prove 100% that they are the ones who wrote the scrolls or kept them. Like, for example, they found their ink and the pens, and of course, I don't know how to call them pens.
Yeah. And to me, honestly, I'll tell you, Ido, to me, it's the stacks of dishes. Because you could say anyone was writing, there are stacks and stacks they found stacks of dishes. Why in the world would you have that many people in one place in a normal situation, right? But if you have a community where they're all eating together in one room, right? That's when you would do it. So there's a lot of things that make sense as the place where the Qumran community lives. To me, I think they live there, right? I do think they live there. I think there's a lot of reasons to say that they live there. There are sometimes I'm confronted by an archaeologist who says, well, and I'm like, well, you know what? If you want to really argue this, go ahead and argue it. I think they live there, but it also doesn't affect, you could prove to me they didn't, and it won't affect anything I wrote or studied. It just won't, it won't have, whereas for an archaeologist, of course, it would change everything in terms of how they interpret the site. But I do think that there's a lot to say that this is where they live. And could they have lived in other places as well? Sure. But that this absolutely was one of the places that they lived.
Miriam?
Yes.
Just to answer my own question, I just took a quick look at Wikipedia.
Okay. Wikipedia.
And apparently Qumran was taken over by Bar Kokhba's soldiers. So the Romans would have been there just from the time of the revolt until Bar Kokhba at the most.
That's nice to hear. You made me happy. Thank you. Did they take it over again after, though? But that made me feel good, so thank you. Moving on, let's take a look at the Genesis Apocryphon. All right, so guys, so this is Genesis Apocryphon on the right here in Aramaic, on the left in English. Okay, and it's and the Genesis Apocryphon is, as you can see, there's a lot missing. We don't have the whole thing, even of the columns that we have. So we're starting kind of in the middle. Habedayin, then Chashaft Bilibi Dimin Irin Harita. And so this person, he says, I thought to myself, Harayata. I thought to myself, this pregnancy is from the Irin, the Watchers. Remember, we talked about how that's what's translated as the Watchers. You could also just translate it as the angels, but here it's clearly the Watchers. And then Umin Kadishin Zara. And from angels is this seed, Ulin Filin, and from those who have fallen. Vilibi ale mishtane al ulame dina. Right? And my you could say my mind was disturbed, or I kind of changed my attitude to, I guess you could say my mind was disturbed because of this child, this infant.
Yeah.
Right?
Can you say a little bit more about if we know a little bit more about this Apocryphon?
Sorry, I missed the end of your
question. Can you say a little bit more about this Genesis Apocryphon? We know anything more about it other than?
Oh, so the Genesis Apocryphon, look, so we know that it wasn't written by the Qumran community. It's written in Aramaic. Again, it dates probably around the 1st century BCE, maybe earlier, could be earlier. It is a retelling. It's what we call rewritten Bible. It's retelling the biblical story. It continues on what we have of it is kind of Noah and Avraham, right? It has the famous, and we're going to get to it in a later class, the famous poem about Sarah's beauty that goes into, various body parts about how beautiful she is. And so it has these expansions. And it's a kind of a poem that's written about her beauty. So it has different sorts of expansions. It may actually be composed, could be that the Noach piece is being added to the Avram piece, because again, there's a whole kind of, theoretically, there's a genre of Noach literature. You find it here and there. It's not super clear just how important it is, but you do have this. And we know that we don't have the whole thing. Right. We'll talk about it more in a later class. But it's a retelling of the biblical story in Aramaic. So anyone who's reading it knows it's not biblical because it's in Aramaic. And it's adding, things that we would want to be, maybe elaborated on, right? Because Paro's advisors come and talk to him of Sarai's beauty. And so here we see what they said, right? So we have these kind of expansions. We see here that clearly it had to be after kind of the Book of the Watchers, or at least until the whole story of the Watchers was very well established. Does this predate the Book of Noah and Enoch, or does the Book of Noah and Enoch predate this? Also very hard to say. It's hard to date that way because you can't, it isn't super clear that which one is based on the other, or maybe they're both drawing from the same tradition that everyone knew and that everyone was writing about. We're going to see, but we're going to see a lot of very, very similar themes in terms of Noah. So here we see, and I'm going to quickly I'm going to switch to the English. Then I, Lamech, became perturbed. I went into my wife, Bat Enosh, right? It's being very clear what she's from that line of Enosh. And a witness by the Most High, by the great Master, by the King of all eternity, the sons of heaven, that you will truthfully tell me everything. You must tell me without falsehood. Essentially, he's saying to her, tell me the truth. Is this kid from an angel? Did you get pregnant from an angel? And that's why I've got this kid. Then my wife, Betamosh, with great vehemence, spoke and cried, and she said, oh, my brother, and oh, my master. And here, if you look in the Aramaic, she spoke and she cried, Ya achi v'ya mari, oh, my brother and oh, my master. Didn't you remember about my youthfulness, my vigor, right? She's getting pretty explicit. She's like, you remember during my time with my breath in its sheath, in other words, I was getting pretty excited. You could feel me, and I am telling you everything truthfully. And then so she's like, she's sweetheart, don't you remember that night, right? And he's supposed to remember that night, right? And then he is, but he still doesn't understand, right? He's still distressed, right? And so, in other words, he doesn't really believe her, right? So now, when my wife Betanosh saw that my countenance was disturbed, she sees that he still doesn't believe her. She curbed her passion, right? So here in right? He's still upset, right? But she held in her spirit. In other words, she was trying to be like very vehement, and she sees that didn't go over. So she tried to be calmer, right? And so she just speaks this time. She doesn't cry. And she says, oh, my master, oh, my brother, don't you remember it again, right? Remember my youthfulness? I swear to you by the great Holy One, by the King of heaven, that this seed is from you, and this pregnancy is from you, and this planting of fruit is from you, and not from any stranger, nor from any watcher, nor from any son of heaven, right? Here, Dimanach Zara, Dan, Umanach Haryona Dan, Umanach Netzaf Priya. Please excuse my Aramaic, it's not good, I know. V'la kol zar, v'la kol irin, v'la kol b'nei shemayin. It's not from any stranger, not from any one of the watchers, irin, right? And not from any member of the heavenly core, right? So why is the form of your countenance so disturbed and deformed, and your spirit so downcast? I am speaking to you truthfully. So Lamech runs very similar to what we have in Enoch. He runs to Methuselah, to Methuselah, his father, and then he goes to Enoch, his father, that he may know everything from him for certain, since he is beloved and desired. His lot is apportioned, and everything is made apparent to him. And when Methuselah heard, he ran to Enoch, his father, to know everything from him truthfully. His will, he went the length of the land of the Parvaim, and he found him at the end. And he said to Enoch, his father, oh, my father, and oh, my master, to whom I am something. And I say to you, do not be angry with me that I came here to, and we're missing a lot of things, right? And here we see now, and so it's very, very fragmentary, right? But we can see that there's a parallel here to stirring up evil. We're talking thing about the Watchers. And to you, Methuselah, my son, that this youth, just as I, Enoch, not from the sons of heaven, rather from Lamech, your son. In other words, he's just as I, Enoch, we don't know. Noach is not from the sons of heaven, rather from Lamech, your son. And in blood, they were not, we don't know. Your son Lamech feared his appearance, right? Why does he fear his appearance, right? We'll see. Go and tell Lamech, your son, that. And now we'll see why he feared his appearance. His face, it lifted up to me, and his eyes shone like the sun. This youth is a flame, right? This son, what's the story? He was glowing. We missed the beginning. We didn't have the beginning. So now we see why he was scared, because this kid was glowing, right? This kid was glowing. He uses a flame, and he blank, the seed from a foreigner. In other words, he was like, hey, this kid's glowing. He's not human. He must be from an angel. In other words, the same thing that we had in Enoch, this idea that he is glowing, right? And so Enoch has to explain here that in fact, Noach is the good guy, right? He's kind of a messianic figure, right? And then we have Noach speaking in column 6. And here we just have the English here. I didn't bring the Aramaic. From iniquity, and in my mother's womb, I sprouted for righteousness. And when I emerged from my mother's womb, I was planted for righteousness. And all my days I practiced righteousness and walked the paths of eternal truth. He who scorns the ways of truth, and to warn me of the path of falsehoods that leads to eternal darkness. And I girded my loins with a vision of truth and wisdom, and with a cloak of, and every, blank, 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 all the paths of lawlessness. Then I, Noach, became a man, and I clung to truth and held firm to wisdom. In other words, I sprang forth in righteousness. How do you know? I came out glowing, right? And I came out looking different, but I wasn't from the angels. I just came out righteous, right? And all my days I practiced righteousness and walked the paths of eternal truth. So here Noach, as the savior of mankind, is an exemplar of pure righteousness from the womb, right? And we see that, and again, it's interesting to compare that with this idea that Moshe, as soon as he's born, glows. He fills up the house with light, right? And again, this idea that how do we know this person who will be, how can we identify it? As a baby, they glow, they light up everything. Right. So is this kind of some kind of Persian, is this a parallel with Persian thought? Is it not a parallel with Persian thought? Or is it happening at the same time? That we can all think about. It's not a surprise that light, that would be something that would be considered divine. Let me look. I see that there is a comment in the chat. Is it reasonable to look at Enoch, or at least certain parts of it, as an early form of midrash? Oh, okay. So let's talk a little bit, and this is a good question. In general, let's talk about midrash, right? And all of these types of early biblical interpretation that we find in Second Temple literature. When we look at Second Temple literature, we in fact find a whole range of interpretation that is the precursor to midrash in some way. Now, what we're used to in rabbinic midrash is that there is a quote of a verse and then the midrash, that we never forget what was written down and what we're adding, okay? That is the main difference that you have when you talk about books like Enoch and other examples of rewritten Bible in this period. So where they're retelling the story without dividing what is written and what they're adding. Now, Enoch is actually pretty, doesn't create problems in terms of interpretation. If you're like, there are certain other books like the Book of Jubilees, where you really, when you read it, you're like, are you actually supposed to throw out Genesis and Exodus and read Jubilees? Is that what the author wants you to do? However, there are passages of Jubilees that don't make sense unless you know the verses in Genesis and Exodus. With Enoch, it's very clear that this is added on. In other words, the whole book of Enoch can't be read instead of Genesis and Exodus. Similarly, if you have something that's written in Aramaic, like the Genesis Apocryphon, it's not meant to be the secret book because it's not written in Hebrew, right? Jubilees is written in Hebrew and is presenting itself as the secret book that Moshe got on Sinai, right? That this is what really happened. So there you have a question, like, what is the author expecting you to do with this book? But with Enoch, it's very clearly an addition, and certain pieces of it are very clearly midrashic, what we would consider midrashic, adding on and sometimes explaining things in the verses, right? What does, why would you give Noah a special name? What about his birth made his father think that this child will comfort us from the curse of the earth? Why would he think that? Well, there needs to be a story explaining it. The child came out looking different, right? And you want to have an explanation that works with all the whole narrative you've already built, right? You've already built this whole thing. Everyone really believes the story about the angels coming down and mating with human women. The timing works not quite perfectly, but almost, right? Say, hey, his wife got pregnant. She had a glowing baby, or a baby that looked divine in some way. He was like, oh no, what is this? He goes to his father, who goes to, luckily enough, his father Enoch, which is very convenient. It's nice to have a grandfather who's hanging around in heaven, ready to be called for advice. He calls Enoch, and Enoch's like, don't worry, I have a whole prophecy for you. He gets the prophecy, and now you understand why he would give Noah his name. And in fact, the giving Noah his name is put into the narrative. So now we understand why he would give Noah this special name, indicating that he will comfort the earth, comfort everyone, and help us, recover from the curse of the earth. So
Noah, excuse me one second.
Yeah?
Noah saves the world from
Right.
From a flood, basically.
Yes. Right.
And how did they understand the pasuk of Zeinach me mitzvon yudein mina adama asher elora Hashem? That's something quite different.
I think the way that they're understanding it is that God cursed the earth because of what the angels did. In other words, if we look back at Enoch, which has the fuller in the Book of Enoch, where it's the fuller account, he goes into the whole thing about the angels came down and they did this in their sin in the land, and the flood's going to cleanse the sin, right? And I think that's how they were reading the curse of the earth, not connecting it back to Adam, but instead connecting it to what the angels did, that brought the curse of sin on the earth, and that Noah will comfort us when the earth is going to be cleansed, and Noah will still allow humanity to survive. I think that is how they're reading that.
Thanks.
Yeah. So, and what we'll find is that many of these works that we're going to read are in fact retelling the biblical story without dividing between where the verse starts, where the verse ends. Let's say they're not quoting the verse, but we will see that they absolutely know how to quote a verse and give an interpretation, because at Qumran they have a type of interpretation called the pesher, where they quote the verse. They're very careful. They quote the verse separately, and then they say, and this is its interpretation, where they keep a separation between the verse and its interpretation. So they can do that, but they tend not to when they're retelling these stories. The pesher is a very specific type of interpretation that also is different from what we're used to. Yes.
Couldn't it be that the Qumran community had this idea that you separate the text from the story, which was their innovation or their a way of them dividing themselves from other people?
I think, so they did consider Jubilees a very important, like they quote Jubilees. They consider Jubilees an important text. It is absolutely possible that when they themselves wrote, they felt that it was, and they do show a tremendous amount of respect for the Torah as written and for Tanakh as written. Now, they might have a different version, but that doesn't mean they don't think that it has to be this way, right? So there's a lot, they'll go, so for example, you'll have someone, they'll have corrections. They'll have a copy of, they'll have a copy and they'll write a correction to the verse in the margin. They will, in the pesher, they're also very careful about quoting God's name. When they're in the interpretation of a pesher, they will generally not use the tetragrammaton, right? Because it's the interpretation. Sometimes even when they quote, though, they won't use the tetragrammaton. Like they're very, very careful with God's name. But absolutely, you could say that maybe part of what is interesting about when they write. On the one hand, they're accepting a lot of what we consider rewritten Bible as true. In other words, they will quote pieces of rewritten Bible as authoritative. On the other hand, when they write, if I'm thinking about it, when they write, they don't write rewritten Bible themselves that I can think of. In other words, they're taking rewritten Bible and considering it authoritative, but when they write their interpretation, you are absolutely right. They keep the verse separate. And I do think that it is also possibly a stage in the canonization of the Bible. In other words, at this point, everyone knows what's in Tanakh. Everyone knows what's in the Bible and the prophets, and everyone considers it very holy and important to preserve the exact words. So on the other hand, you still have the different versions, right? That some people are reading different versions. They might argue about what's the right version, but that version needs to be preserved, and you can't mess with it, right? So it's an interesting thing to kind of explore, because it is true that in the Pesher they're very careful, except there is a place where they misquote Amos, and it's not clear if they're misquoting it because they made a mistake and they think that's the version, or they're misquoting it because the misquote works way better with their interpretation. So it is a little bit of a question. But yes, I like that idea, and I think it's a reasonable idea. I don't know if I would never necessarily say it's their innovation, but it absolutely is the sort of thing that makes sense with them as a group to be much more careful about than perhaps some other Jewish groups.
One more question on that.
Mm-hmm.
I see two things here which are very much rabbinic. One is, the separation of midrash and text, and the other is a very strong carefulness of God's name. It's interesting that we generally don't think the rabbinic tradition took from the Qumran sect, and here it is. I don't know if you find these in other parts of other parts of the Second Temple, but here similarities are striking.
Yeah, I think that there absolutely are things that are in common, and I think also, and we'll see this when we look at how the rule books interpret texts, and when we look at the rule books, that the similarities, they're very what you could call halachic, just different halacha. In other words, this is one of the arguments I sometimes get in, like, not an argument, but sometimes when I was studying for my PhD, so sometimes I would meet very religious Orthodox people. They'd be like, oh, so they're like conservatives, right? And I'd be like, no, to them, we're the conservatives with a big C, right? In other words, they were much stricter, right, than other Jewish groups, including the Prushim, right? The Prushim, they felt the Prushim were really, really lax with stuff. They're like, they are not being careful. We are being careful. So how can we rely on these guys? They're not careful, right? So they were being very careful about various things that they felt other groups were not being careful. And they also cared very much in terms of, so when they say, you guys you guys are marrying more, you say you can marry more than one wife, but Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, 1-on-1, right? Noah's Ark, 2 by 2. And that's the proof. There's your proof, right? One man, one woman, right? They're like, you say you can marry your aunt, your uncle. No, you can't marry your aunt. They say you can marry your uncle. We see that verse is clearly talking to both genders. They're like, it's using the male gender. It's clearly speaking to both genders. No, you cannot marry your uncle. You can't marry your niece. No, right? And you're like, okay, they're reading it, they're explaining, they're interpreting it, and they're very sure that they're right. And they're not doing it to make things easy for themselves. They're doing it because they're like, this is the way, right? So that's why it gets so frustrating for them. They're like, why doesn't everyone believe us? Why doesn't everyone follow what we're doing? And that, of course, is Blial. That is the influence of Blial. In various ways, and that is how they understand why everyone doesn't accept that their halacha is correct. Yes,
isn't the general understanding that the sectarian tendencies of the Dead Sea sect are that they're breaking away from the Tzukim and they're rebelling against the Tzukim. And as far as the Prushim are concerned, they're beyond help.
Okay, so Larry Schiffman was my advisor. He did consider that they had broken off from the Tzdokim, that they had broken off from the Tzdokim, and that there were the Tzdokim who weren't so religious and who compromised with the Prushim in the temple, right? And there are and these guys were like, we're Tzdokim that actually care. We're Tzdokim that we're going to keep the right halacha, and we're breaking off from you guys. And that's that Larry Schiffman has made that argument since 4QMMT came to light. It's a text where they explain why they separated out, and it points specifically to certain halachic disagreements that we knew were disagreements between the Tzdokim and the Prushim, and we had only heard of it from the Prushi side. We had heard of it from our Talmud, like we come from the Prushim, right? We had heard of it from the Prushim side, and now we were seeing it from, as it were, the Tzdoki side. So as soon as Larry Schiffman saw that, he's like, okay, they're Tzdokim. They're keeping halacha of the Tzdokim. So that is absolutely his approach. Most people don't accept that approach because they like to call them Essenes or connected to Essenes. They are not. I think that there have been good, as I've mentioned before, there have been very good arguments to show that they were not one-to-one Essenes. Essenes are always described as not marrying, or at least most of them not marrying. I think Josephus says that some of the cities did marry, but that is something that nowhere in the Qumran rules do they say you are not allowed to marry. The Damascus document mentions wives. The Serach, the rule book that's written for the Messianic age, says at what age men are allowed to marry. They cannot marry very, very young, but they are considered. So while at Qumran, there probably were no women living at Qumran, it does not seem like that they had a major rule against marriage. So that would already separate them from the Essenes that we have heard about. At the same time, getting into the Qumran community sounds very much like what Josephus describes for the Essenes. So it's possible that they're connected to the Essenes. That they were off, that they're offshoots of a similar idea, a similar sect. And again, it's the question of were they separating out from what they describe in terms of separating out. They're describing disagreements with what we know of as Prushi. I don't like to say Pharisee for Prushi, but like that's closest English, Pharisee halacha, right? So they were arguing with Pharisaic halacha, right? They were more strict, right? That's what they're describing in Miksat Masei Torah. We know the Pharisaic halacha from the Gemara. So when they say, "Oh, we do this other thing," we can automatically say, "Oh yeah, that's the other side." We know of these arguments between the Prushim and the Tzdokim. Again, for lack of better English words, Pharisees and the Sadducees. So the Prushim and the Tzdokim had these disagreements, and they're taking the Tzdoki side. Now, the fact that they're taking the Tzdoki side, does that mean that they separated off from the Tzdokim, or they separate off from the Pharisees or from the Prushim, right? So that becomes that's a question. The fact is that what we learn about in the Mishnah is that what it's conveying is this idea that in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, at the same time that I'm just going to use the English, that the Pharisees were in charge, you had Sadducees also serve it, right? And that there were arguments there, and the Pharisees had to be like, no, we are going to make, and enforcing the laxer halacha, enforcing the more permissive halacha, which is difficult to do, right? And they were enforcing it by saying, no, we're going to make you impure. We're going to make you impure so that we know that you are following the laxer halacha in terms of becoming pure again, right? And doing all sorts of things to make sure you're keeping the Prushi law. So if there was a largish group of Tzoki priests in the temple, you could understand some people's, kind of separating out from them. The way they talk, though, is that all the Jews should be following them. In other words, the way they write is that everyone should just have their eyes open and follow them. It's not that, oh, you know, it depends what you read, right? It depends which one. Like the Damascus document is more understanding of people who haven't seen the light. The community rule is less understanding generally. It seems to have gone through different revisions, you know, more understanding revisions and less understanding revisions also the community rule. So it's absolutely possible that at a certain point they were like, you know what, screw all of them, you know, excuse me, right? They're like, okay, they're all going to hell, see you guys, see you in hell, have fun with the demons, right? They're like, hey, they all follow a demon, enough is enough, they are all following a demon, we're just going to cheer when they go down, right? But it's not that way in every text, and it's not that way at every stage. And there are arguments about what stage is what, right? Because you could also see that maybe they were more strict in the beginning and then they kind of loosened up a little. You could say that too. But I think it makes sense to say that in the beginning, or more towards the beginning, or at times when they weren't persecuted as much, they had more of a hope that people would just join them. That everyone would just see that they're right. If you're like, we're the right ones, we're the correct ones, can't everyone see it? And you have a hope that everyone's going to open their eyes and see it, right? I think we can all understand that, right? So you don't give up on everyone so fast. So I think there were different stages, and different books and different works kind of show different stages in the thought of the group in terms of, are we giving up on everyone, or do we still hope that everyone's going to see the light and join? Certainly in the text of Mikset Maseh Torah, that text that I was talking about that shows the halachic differences, it's framed as writing to a Hasmonean ruler saying, listen, we know you're a really good king. Just open your, just do the right thing and follow the right law, because we see that you're a good guy. You know, so we're just telling you the right thing to do. So now do it. Now, in general, it's considered that letter was never actually written, you know, he was never actually sent to him, put it that way, right? But still, the way it's framed is, we see you're a good king. You just need to realize that's why we're writing, right? Because we know that you want to do the right thing. So here, this is the right thing. So it's not true that at every stage they were like, let's write everyone off. They absolutely had hope that people would just, you know, kind of see that they've got it right. Okay, great. So thank you for joining me.